Hi, everyone. Pastor Galen, lead pastor at Cheyenne Hills Church. Thank you so much for joining us on this podcast. We hope that these podcasts will be a real encouragement to you on your spiritual journey. You can also connect with Cheyenne Hills at CheyenneHills.org. Hope you enjoy the program.
We are across the street and around the world, Cheyenne Hills.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's great to join with you today. I'm running solo this go-around. Galen had another appointment that he had to run to, but the wonderful thing, since I have the bully pulpit and he's not here, I get to brag about him a little bit. A lot of times when you do that in person, it always makes it uncomfortable, but Galen has been a tremendous blessing to my life, to Family Policy Alliance, of course, but I have, through the years ago, Kenny White, the former associate pastor here, he's been a dear friend of mine for going on 15 years. And he's the one that introduced me to Galen. And so I've had the chance to observe for years all the ways in which God has used him, and because of him, your church, to bless people across the state of Wyoming. And so since he's not here, can I just say to you, I am so grateful that God has led him and you as a church into my life personally. And so today, since it's just me, what I wanted to do is talk to you a little bit about the heart that drives a Christian in interacting in the world around us. And where I'm going to take this from is from John chapter 8 and verse 12. That's the famous verse that reads, "Then Jesus spoke to them, saying, I am the light of the world. He who follows me shall not walk in darkness, but shall have the light of life." This is a vital verse. But when we get into the heart of what that verse is and start understanding the circumstances where he is speaking from, it actually brings it to an all new light. Now, let me start off by saying this. Have you ever been in a place that's so dark it exceeds any other previous understanding of what darkness felt like? My wife and I and my children were in a situation like that a number of years ago. It was in Marvel Caverns, I believe it's called, in Branson, Missouri. And now let me just set the stage. You go down 75 feet into a sinkhole, first of all, and all the way down, the tour guide, the lady that was guiding us down there, she kept saying over and over and over again, like a mantra, she kept saying, listen, when you get inside the door that we're going to open up, I don't want you to be shocked about how deep you're going to be looking down. And she said it again and again and again. There were about 14 people in our group, and I was so glad she made mention of that, because when we got into the cave, we got to this concrete wall and the big door with padlocks on it, and she unlocked the padlocks, and we stepped out onto a metal landing and looked down about 6 stories. It blew my mind. To be in the ground and looking down that far was astonishing to me. And as we started descending, of course, there's a lot of water in Missouri. And so it was almost like it was raining inside. There were waterfalls gushing everywhere, and you'd have been just kind of washed away, except that they had built these canopies over the trail. As we got all the way down to the bottom, she gathered the group around, and finally she said, let me tell you about this cave. It has a lot of flora and fauna that are very special here in the Ozarks. One of the things she started talking about was bats. Now, right in front of my family and I, there were these 2 guys who were evidently not from an area where there's a lot of outdoors. And as she starts talking about bats, they started growing very concerned. They started asking a lot more questions. And she was so excited talking about bats, I think she misread the reason for the questions. I think they were afraid that these giant blood-sucking animals were going to come and suck them dry of all of the blood in their body. And yet she was having so much fun describing, I think, the 14 different varieties of bats in the room. Anyway, it was extraordinary. I listened to one of them actually get kind of high-pitched and start to squeal a bit. It was fun. But anyway, we got 3/4 of the way down this trail. And finally, she had an assistant turn all the lights off that were along the trail, and until only her flashlight was left. It felt very, very dark. And finally, she said, now, please don't be alarmed. I want to give you an experience you may not find anywhere else. I'm going to turn my flashlight, and you're going to experience total darkness. And so she turned her flashlight off. my kids suddenly were sticking to me like glue. Matter of fact, I was glad they were, because I was about to stick to them like glue. You know, somewhere way back in the medulla oblongata of my brain, I started thinking this might be a foolish situation. I'm not sure about this, but since I didn't want to turn in my dad card, I went ahead and I just tried to stay secure. And a little ways into that, finally, she began to talk. This is what total darkness is. One of those guys from the city finally said, "Can we please turn on the lights?" And she turned the lights back on. Let me tell you something that was interesting. When she turned on the flashlight, that tiny little light in this giant cavern suddenly was imbued with more purpose, more symbolism than I can recall at any other time in my life. That light became the picture of hope. It meant that we could escape. It meant we knew how to get out of the situation we were in. When John talks about light, he's using something so powerful. He is the one of all of the apostles that really speaks about it the most. According to my calculations, as I tried to study this out, John was the one who, I believe, 14 out of 17 times used darkness as a picture in the scripture. And then more than any other person, he uses light as a picture as well, about 36 times between the books of John, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, and Revelation. He uses this imagery because it is so powerful, pointing out how we as Christians ought to live our lives as well. And in this statement, he begins by describing how Jesus describes himself. Jesus said, "I am the light of the world. He who follows me shall not walk in darkness, but shall have the light of life." Now, this was a statement Jesus was making at a very specific setting. He's saying this in John chapter 8, but the setting for it is found in John chapter 7, verse 2. In that passage, we find that he is at a specific festival called the Feast of Ingathering. That's what it was called in the Old Testament. It became known also as the Feast of Tabernacles or the Feast of Booths. It was an ancient Jewish ceremony, a pilgrimage feast. But that meant that there were thousands of people who had flocked to Jerusalem for this specific event. And there were two beautiful ceremonies that had become associated with this event through the years. One of them was a beautiful lighting ceremony. Now, let me tell you about that. Every night of the week, 4 giant candelabra would be illuminated in an area called the Court of the Women. It was a huge celebration. And the way you can think of that, because they would sing and they would dance and people would bring their own torches and they would line the area. Think of a Jewish wedding and the kind of celebration that they were experiencing. The following morning, to the best of our ability to understand, it could have been even that night, this is where he makes the statement, "I am the light of the world." Now, that ceremony was a ceremony in remembrance of the burning pillar of fire that guided the children of Israel at night as they were escaping Egypt and moving into the promised land. And so when he makes this statement, this beautiful statement, the first thing I want you to see is this clear statement that Jesus, as the light of the world, is tying himself directly to the Shekinah glory of God, the shining glory, the holiness of the God that guided through the wilderness, and also who is present in that very day, whom they were celebrating at that ceremony. Secondly, he is saying, "I am the joy of the feast celebrated by your fathers. I am the pillar of fire to guide you." It's a beautiful picture that he's expressing here. But secondly, in this statement, he's saying this. That statement is based upon the idea that there is darkness in the world. I don't have to describe to you all the darkness that we're seeing in our culture, in the world around us, as we hear people deny truths that have been understood since the foundation of humanity. Somehow in the last 10 years, we have turned a specific corner into a new kind of darkness. And when we look at why a Christian speaks and talks the way they do, it is because we are called to be light shiners, but we understand that there is darkness. So first of all, Jesus is the light of the world. Secondly, we recognize that there is darkness. And thirdly, there's another interesting detail. In this particular verse, Jesus is making the statement about him being the light, about the fact that there is darkness, but then thirdly, he talks about how there is a way in which a follower of Christ will live out their life and will shine light into the world around us, and is tied directly with his own person. Now, when we talk about the person of Christ and the kind of light that we are sharing, it's amazing. You can stay right in the book of John and go to chapter number 1. That's the famous passage where Jesus is introduced by John in this way. John says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God." And he begins to talk about the very foundation of the world and how Jesus was there. In verse 14, he talks about how Jesus, that the Word became flesh and dwelled among us. But if you go back to verse number 9, it talks about light in this way, and it introduces an adjective to this. It's very interesting. It says, "That was the true light." He makes a statement, "In him was life, and the life was the light of men, and the light shines in darkness, and the darkness cannot comprehend it." Then down in verse number 9, it says, "That was the," now this is the first time an adjective is used to describe light. "That was the true light, which lights every man that comes into the world." I love that word. In Greek, it's to phos to alethenon. You'll recognize the word phos for phosphorescent. It literally is the light, the true. He's compounding that. The light, the true. He is the true light. There are so many lights in the world that can distract us. As a Christian, I know that you've experienced this before, where there are things that call your attention. John even talks about this in the book of 1 John, where he talks about the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, the pride of life. He talks about those things that are fancy things and beautiful people or exalted positions that can be used to lure the Christian away from where they ought to be. And it could be the house that you've TiVo'd, where you look and, you know, I'll tell you about one I remember. It had a shooting gallery in the basement. It was a country music star's house, and I thought, man, that would be so fun. I didn't know this would turn into confession time, but just bear with me here. It can be those kind of things that are not necessarily wrong in and of themselves, but they certainly are deceiving lights. And you contrast that with the true light of God. When we look at, take it a step further, when we look at those who have academic credentials that tell you things that are opposite the common sense, the understood natural law and order of the world around us, and because of their credential, they seem like a deceptive light. Know this, that when it comes to Christ, he is the true light, and you can trust him. It means he has no hidden agenda. I love that. No hidden agenda. He's pure. He's holy. He's righteous. You can trust him because he is faithful and true. He is the true light. Now, secondly, when we talk about darkness and talk about how John actually delves into this a little bit in a famous passage in John chapter 3, where Jesus is talking to Nicodemus. And Nicodemus is asking so many questions, and he begins to get to this point. You know the famous passage in John 3:16, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him will not perish but have everlasting life." And a couple verses later, he's continuing his talk with Nicodemus, and he says this, "This is the condemnation, that light has come into the world, and men love darkness rather than light, because their deeds are evil." No one naturally has an affinity for light unless there is something wrong. When I was a little boy, my parents used to send me out to the tomato patch. We lived way out in the country, and Mom had a 1-acre garden, and it seemed like she would always wait till dusk to let me know that she needed tomatoes for dinner. And I have an older brother, pray for him, Pray for the people that he pastors now. I love picking on him. Wayne used to pick on me when I was a kid, so this is the rare occasion I get to pick back a little bit. Wayne, who's 10 years older than me, used to convince me that there are these mountain lions and cougars and pumas and everything else that are just waiting to eat little boys on the way to the tomato patch. And the way he would talk about it, he said, they're really, really dark, and so you'll never see them. They're very stealthy, and the last thing you'll see is you'll see their eyeballs coming to get you. And if you do, you're gone. And so I had to go pick tomatoes with that running through my mind. And so I would, in my little boy voice, I would sing as loud as I could all the way from the back door, all the way out to the tomato patch before I came back. And that probably just let all the mountain lions know where I was, but at least someone would know that something bad had happened when I stopped singing. That was my thinking anyway. I know this, I don't naturally like dark. No one does. And when we talk about what the Bible's explaining here, men love darkness rather than light because of a specific thing, because their deeds are evil. And there is a spiritual sense in which people enjoy darkness. It's because of a kind of evil understanding. That the Bible even goes on. Jesus says this, "For everyone practicing evil hates the light and does not come to the light, lest his deeds should be exposed." What we're talking about here is a kind of rebellion because of sin, because their deeds would be exposed. There is a world around us that is dark. And so when Jesus says, "I am the light of the world," and he points toward this darkness in which the light is shining, he then turns around and says this, that someone that follows him will walk in the light. He's speaking very specifically about being a light shiner because here's how he phrased it. "I am the light of the world. He who follows me shall not walk in darkness, but have the light of life." My hope and goal across Wyoming is to help people become better bearers of the light of God. And that's really where we all ought to live, where we all ought to act. You have the light of life. And if you do, that means there's something very unique and special about a child of God. We don't walk in darkness. That means that we exhibit hope. We walk in life. We walk in light. We have joy. There is a beautiful kind of life that is exhibited by being a Christian. We walk differently. We talk differently. We think differently. He who says he abides in him ought also to walk even as he walked. Jesus is saying, or John was saying in 1 John there, he's saying that Jesus walked a certain way and someone who follows him will walk in the same way. And so we walk as Jesus walked. And that's what I'm calling you toward. To be light in the darkness. And what light does in darkness is illuminates. Let me phrase it this way, and I'm kind of paraphrasing from a hero of mine, C.S. Lewis, but he points out, he says, the same light that reveals the beautiful mountain meadows of glory reveals the back alleys of trash at the same time. And it shines equally on both. One of the things about being a light bearer is our hope is to illuminate the way for people to come to Christ. But sometimes in doing that, you point out what sin looks like. And you warn people because of love, you warn them of the consequences of sin and how it harms their life and how it harms those around them. And you stand for truth in love. And that's my great call to you, to be a light bearer, to stand for truth in a dark world. Because you have been called to live even as Jesus lived, to be a light bearer and a follower of God. And so with that, I want to say, it's been a joy spending a little time with you. Normally, Galen would be here to close us out, but really, this will give a greater sense to the understanding in the way that he always closes out our conversations. He talks about be strong and very courageous. The way to do that is to bear the light of Christ in a dark world. Thank you so much for your time.